In the frozen mud of December 1944, a German tank commander named Otto Carius stood beside his disabled Tiger, watching the horizon fill with shapes. Not dozens. Hundreds. They rolled forward in waves that seemed to have no end, each one identical to the last. M4 Shermans. Tin coffins, his instructors had called them. Inferior machines crewed by inferior men, yet here they were, replacing losses faster than his guns could inflict them. Something in that moment broke inside him, not courage, but certainty. The mathematics of the war had changed, and no amount of German engineering could multiply fast enough to match it. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. This is the story of how America didn't just outfight Germany, it outbuilt it. How 50,000 Sherman tanks rolled off assembly lines in less than 4 years, while the entire Axis war machine produced barely half that number. And how German tankers, raised on myths of Aryan superiority and mechanical perfection, learned the hardest lesson of industrial war. Quality is a luxury. Quantity is a weapon. Stay to the end for the moment when pride met production, and support for more untold truths from World War II. January 1942. The drawing boards at the Detroit Arsenal tank plant still smelled of fresh ink and cigarette smoke. Engineers hunched over blueprints, sketching angles and armor thickness, calculating weight ratios and transmission torque. They weren't designing a tank to win duels. They were designing a tank to win a war. The M4 Sherman wasn't born from genius. It was born from pragmatism, from the cold realization that America had entered a conflict where it possessed almost no modern armored force and faced enemies who had spent years perfecting theirs. The meeting rooms where these decisions were made were thick with tension and tobacco smoke. General Jacob Devers, chief of the armored force, sat across from industrial executives who had spent their careers building Buicks and Chevrolets, not instruments of war. The challenge before them was unprecedented. Design a tank that could be manufactured by workers who had never seen a military vehicle, make it reliable enough to cross oceans and continents, simple enough that farm boys could learn to operate it in weeks, and build it in numbers that would eclipse anything the world had ever seen. William Knudsen, former president of General Motors and now head of the Office of Production Management, laid out the reality in blunt terms. Germany had a 5-year head start. Their panzer divisions were battle-tested, their factories already optimized for tank production. America was starting from nearly zero. The only advantage was industrial capacity, and that advantage meant nothing unless it could be converted into actual tanks, actual weapons, actual results. The men in that room understood something that would define the entire American war effort. Speed mattered more than perfection. A good tank delivered in 6 months was worth more than a perfect tank delivered in 2 years. The enemy wasn't going to wait for American engineers to achieve technical superiority. The war was happening now, and every day without tanks was another day of Axis expansion. The German panzer divisions had crushed Poland in weeks, shattered France in months, and were grinding eastward into the Soviet Union with mechanical efficiency. Their tanks, the Panzer III, the Panzer IV, and soon the monstrous Tiger and Panther, were marvels of engineering. Thick armor, powerful guns, sophisticated optics, but they shared one fatal flaw. They were slow to produce, expensive to maintain, and nearly impossible to replace in the field. America's planners understood something Germany never would. Wars are not won by the best tanks. They are won by the most tanks. Around a single brutal truth. It had to be simple enough that a factory worker who had never built a tank could assemble one in weeks, light enough to cross bridges that German heavies would collapse, reliable enough that a crew with basic training could keep it running under fire, and cheap enough to build in numbers that would drown the enemy in steel. Its armor was adequate, not exceptional, sloped at the front to deflect shells, but only 2.5 inches thick in most places. A German 88mm gun could punch through it at over a mile. Its main gun, a 75mm M3, was effective against most German tanks in 1942, but would struggle against the heavier armour arriving in 1943 and beyond. Its speed, 30 miles per hour on flat ground, made it fast by tank standards, but its height made it an easy target. German gunners joked that shooting a Sherman was like aiming at a barn, yet none of this mattered to the men designing it. They weren't building a dueling weapon, they were building a system. The Sherman's engine was a Continental R975, a radial aircraft engine modified for ground use, mass-produced, interchangeable, and easy to repair. Its transmission was based on civilian truck designs. Its tracks were wide, spreading weight to prevent sinking in mud. Every part was standardized. A damaged Sherman could be repaired using components from another wrecked Sherman. Entire tanks could be rebuilt in field depots within days. And the factories, oh, the factories. By the summer of 1942, assembly lines stretched across 11 major plants from Detroit to Los Angeles. Fisher Body, Chrysler, Ford, Pressed Steel Car Company, each one converted from producing automobiles and locomotives into producing war. Conveyor belts carried turrets, hulls, engines, and tracks through stations where workers, many of them women who had never touched industrial machinery before, welded, riveted, and bolted with assembly line precision. The transformation was staggering. Buildings that had once assembled sedans now birthed 30-ton war machines. The Fisher Body plant in Grand Blanc, Michigan, had produced Buick bodies just months earlier. By summer 1942, its floor space was reconfigured into specialized stations, hull welding in the North Bay, turret assembly in the East Wing, engine installation in a climate-controlled section where Continental radials were mated to transmissions with tolerances measured in thousandths of an inch. Women like Rosie Monroe, who became the face of Rosie the Riveter, worked 12-hour shifts operating rivet guns that hammered steel plates together with pneumatic force. The noise was so intense that workers communicated through hand signals. Hearing loss was common. Burns from welding torches marked arms and faces. Yet absenteeism remained remarkably low. These workers understood what hung in the balance. Each shift began, with production targets posted on massive boards visible from every station. Today's goal: 18 hulls, 22 turrets, 15 complete assemblies. Foremen moved between stations with clipboards, tracking progress in 15-minute increments. When bottlenecks appeared, workers were shifted instantly. If the engine installation bay fell behind, welders from the completed hull section would be temporarily reassigned. The entire factory operated like a single organism, constantly adjusting, optimizing, accelerating. The training programs were brutal in their efficiency. New hires, many of them housewives or farmhands with zero industrial experience, received 3 days of instruction before being placed on the line. They learned one task, perfected it through repetition, then moved to the next station. Within 2 weeks, a woman who had never held a wrench could install a transmission mounting bracket in 4 minutes flat. Within a month, she could do it in 2. Quality control was obsessive. Every weld was inspected. Every bolt torqued to specification. Turrets were test-fired before installation. Engines were run for 2 hours under load to identify failures before the tank left the factory. Rejected components were immediately sent back for rework. The rejection rate in early 1942 hovered around 15%. By year's end, it had dropped to 3%. The workers were learning faster than anyone had predicted. The noise was deafening, hammers clanging on steel, welding torches hissing, the grinding screech of metal cut and shaped. Air compressors roared continuously, feeding pneumatic tools that never stopped moving. The smell was distinct, a mixture of cutting oil, ozone from arc welders, fresh paint, and the acrid bite of grinding dust. In summer, temperatures inside the plants topped 100 degrees. In winter, the massive doors stayed open for ventilation, and workers welded in freezing drafts. Shifts ran 24 hours. The day shift clocked in at 6 in the morning and worked until 6 at night. The night shift took over immediately, maintaining continuous production. On weekends, skeleton crews performed maintenance, replacing worn tooling, recalibrating presses, sweeping mountains of metal shavings into bins for recycling. The plants never truly stopped. Even on Christmas Day, 1942, partial shifts kept critical stations running. Production quotas climbed every month. In January 1942, America built fewer than 500 Shermans. By December, the number had tripled. But even 1,500 tanks per month wasn't enough. The targets were revised upward: 2,000 per month by spring 1943, 3,000 by summer. Goals that seemed impossible became routine through incremental improvements. A faster rivet pattern here, a redesigned jig there. Seconds shaved from every task, multiplied across thousands of repetitions into hours saved, tanks completed, victories enabled. Trains carried them east to ports where they were loaded onto Liberty ships bound for Britain, North Africa, and the Pacific. Entire freight yards were dedicated to tank transport. Flat cars stretched for miles, each carrying a freshly painted Sherman, its gun tube tied down, its hatches sealed against salt spray. Longshoremen in New York, Philadelphia, and Los Angeles worked around the clock, using massive cranes to hoist 30-ton tanks into cargo holds. The Liberty ships themselves were marvels of mass production, welded together in weeks, using the same principles that built the Shermans they carried. The scale of this operation defied comprehension. By the end of 1942, one Sherman was leaving an American factory every 45 minutes. Not one per day, not one per hour, one every 45 minutes, and the pace kept accelerating. The assembly line had become a weapon, and it was pointed at the heart of the Axis. Across the Atlantic, German intelligence officers studied reports with growing unease. Photographs showed endless rows of Shermans parked in British depots. Captured documents revealed production schedules that seemed impossible. One Abwehr report from late 1942 noted with alarm that American output had exceeded all Axis tank production combined. The analysis concluded with a single line that would prove prophetic. If these numbers are accurate, the war is already lost. But the numbers were worse than the Abwehr suspected. German intelligence, hampered by poor human sources in America and limited aerial reconnaissance, consistently underestimated American production by 30 to 40%. When their analysts projected that America might build 15,000 tanks by the end of 1943, the actual number would exceed 25,000. The gap between perception and reality was widening every month, and Germany's leadership either didn't know or refused to believe it. Bendler Block, the War Ministry headquarters in Berlin, staff officers gathered intelligence from multiple sources. Neutral diplomats reported seeing endless tank convoys moving through American rail yards. Swiss businessmen with contacts in Detroit spoke of factories running triple shifts. Luftwaffe reconnaissance flights over Britain photographed depot after depot filled with newly arrived Shermans. The evidence was overwhelming, yet it contradicted everything German doctrine taught about industrial warfare. General Heinz Guderian, the architect of German armoured warfare, reviewed the intelligence summaries with a growing sense of dread. He had visited American factories before the war as part of a military exchange program. He had seen Ford's River Rouge complex, a single facility that could produce an automobile every 49 seconds. He understood, perhaps better than anyone in German command, what American industry was capable of when fully mobilized. His warnings were ignored. The prevailing belief in Berlin was that quality would triumph over quantity, that German engineering, German training, and German tactical superiority would overcome any numerical disadvantage. This wasn't mere propaganda. It was deeply embedded in Prussian military tradition going back centuries. From Frederick the Great to von Moltke, German commanders had won battles while outnumbered through superior discipline and battlefield innovation. Why should this war be any different? The answer was industrial scale. Previous wars had been fought with weapons that took weeks or months to produce. A Mauser rifle required skilled craftsmen and precision machining. An artillery piece demanded specialized foundries and careful assembly. But tanks, especially tanks designed for mass production like the Sherman, could be built using automotive techniques that America had perfected over decades. The German military was still thinking in terms of craftsmen. America was thinking in terms of assembly lines. Reports from North Africa began to change some minds. German officers who had actually faced Sherman-equipped units returned with troubling accounts. Yes, individual Shermans were inferior to German tanks in armor and firepower, but they never appeared individually. They came in platoons, companies, entire battalions. When one was destroyed, two more took its place. When a German company knocked out a dozen American tanks in a single engagement, expecting the Americans to withdraw and regroup, they instead found themselves facing fresh units the next morning. Colonel Hans von Luck, commanding a reconnaissance battalion in Tunisia, wrote in his journal, "We celebrate destroying 10 American tanks as if we have won a victory. But the Americans do not mourn these losses the way we would. They shrug, request replacements, and attack again the next day with 10 new tanks. This is not warfare, as we understand it. This is arithmetic, and we are losing the count." Berlin, such warnings were dismissed. General staff officers pointed to successful engagements where Tigers had destroyed multiple Shermans without loss. They emphasized that German tanks were still technically superior. They noted, correctly, that in one-on-one encounters, German armor usually prevailed. What they failed to grasp was that one-on-one encounters were becoming statistically irrelevant. The war had moved beyond individual duels and into the realm of industrial attrition. But in Berlin, such warnings were dismissed. German commanders believed in the superiority of their designs. The Panzer IV had proven itself in France and Russia. The new Tiger, with its 88mm gun and armor thick enough to shrug off most Allied fire, was entering production. Quality, they insisted, would triumph over quantity. One Tiger could destroy 10 Shermans. One Panther could hold a road against 50. What they failed to understand was that America would build 60. The men, crewing those Shermans, weren't supermen. They were farmhands from Iowa, factory workers from Pittsburgh, college students from California. Most had never seen a tank before boot camp. Their training was measured in weeks, not years. They learned to drive on dirt tracks, to fire at stationary targets, to coordinate over crackling radios. They were taught to fight in teams, to use numbers and mobility to overwhelm enemies with better armor and bigger guns. German tankers, by contrast, were professionals. Many had years of experience, had fought in Poland, France, and the endless steppes of Russia. They knew their machines intimately, could hear a failing transmission from the sound of the engine, could estimate range by the shape of a target's silhouette. They had been taught that their tanks were the finest in the world, and for a time, that was true. But war is not a gentleman's duel. It is attrition, logistics, and mathematics written in blood and steel. And by the spring of 1943, the mathematics were turning against Germany. The first major test came in North Africa, Tunisia, May 1943. The desert shimmered under heat that made the horizon waver like water. German and Italian forces, battered by months of retreat, had dug in around a series of hills and valleys, preparing for a final stand. They had tanks, artillery, and the terrain. What they didn't have was fuel, ammunition, or reinforcements. The American 2nd Armored Division rolled forward in columns that stretched for miles. Shermans advanced in wedges, supported by infantry, artillery, and air cover. When German guns opened fire, the lead tanks were hit, some burning, others crippled. But the advance didn't stop. For every Sherman destroyed, 2 more appeared. When a German position was identified, American artillery plastered it with high explosive shells, while tank destroyers maneuvered for flank shots. German officers watching through binoculars felt something they hadn't experienced before. Not fear, but inevitability. They could kill American tanks, and they did, in numbers that should have broken any attack. But the Americans kept coming. Fresh crews climbed into fresh tanks and resumed the assault as if nothing had happened. One German lieutenant wrote in his diary, "We are killing them, but they do not stop. It is like fighting the ocean." When Tunisia fell, the Axis lost over 250,000 men, along with hundreds of tanks, trucks, and guns they could never replace. The Americans lost tanks too, dozens of them, but within weeks, replacement Shermans arrived by ship, were unloaded, fueled, and crewed as if the losses had never occurred. It was a preview of what was to come, a war where German excellence would drown under American abundance. Back in the factories, production accelerated, new variants emerged. The M4A1 with a cast hull for faster production, the M4A2 with a diesel engine for the Soviets and Marines, the M4A3 with the Ford GAA engine, more powerful and reliable. Each iteration refined the design, fixing weaknesses, improving performance, but always maintaining the core principle: simplicity, standardization, speed of production. By the end of 1943, America had built over 20,000 Shermans. Germany, in the same period, had produced fewer than 6,000 tanks of all types combined. The Tiger, their most feared weapon, numbered in the hundreds. Impressive machines, but statistically irrelevant. You cannot win a war with hundreds when your enemy fields tens of thousands. Yet the myth persisted. German propaganda films showed Tigers crushing Soviet 34s, Panthers shrugging off shells that would cripple lesser tanks. Crews were told that German engineering was unmatched, that one German tank equaled 5 Allied tanks, and in isolated engagements, this was sometimes true. A well-positioned Tiger could destroy an entire platoon of Shermans before being overwhelmed. A Panther in ambush could pick off targets at ranges where return fire was impossible. But wars are not fought in isolation. They are fought across continents, through forests, cities, deserts, and rivers. They are fought with fuel that must be transported, ammunition that must be stockpiled, spare parts that must be manufactured and delivered. And in every one of these categories, Germany was failing. By 1944, the disparity had become catastrophic. American factories were producing one Sherman every 45 minutes. German factories struggled to produce one Panther per day. Fuel shortages meant German tanks sat immobile, waiting for gasoline that would never arrive. Spare parts were scavenged from wrecks because new ones couldn't be manufactured fast enough. Meanwhile, American logistics transformed war into science. Shermans were shipped across the Atlantic in Liberty ships built in weeks. They were unloaded at ports in Britain and France, driven to depots where mechanics checked every system, then delivered to frontline units with full fuel and ammunition loads. If a Sherman threw a track, a recovery vehicle towed it to a field workshop where it was repaired within hours. If it was destroyed, the crew was reassigned to a replacement tank waiting in reserve. The system was so efficient that American tank units often had more vehicles than crews. Shermans sat in depots, engines idling, waiting for someone to drive them into battle. It was abundance on a scale Germany could not comprehend, could not counter, and ultimately could not survive. June 6, 1944, Normandy. The beaches were chaos incarnate, men wading through surf under machine gun fire, engineers blowing gaps in barbed wire, tanks struggling up sand that swallowed their tracks. But within hours, the first Shermans were ashore. Waterproofed, equipped with wading stacks, they churned through the surf and up the bluffs, their 75mm guns blasting concrete bunkers and pillboxes. German defenders, dug into positions they believed impregnable, watched in disbelief as more tanks kept arriving. Dozens in the first hours, hundreds by the end of the day. Panzer units, rushed forward in piecemeal counterattacks, found themselves outnumbered and outmaneuvered. The hedgerows of Normandy became a grinding war of attrition. Narrow lanes, thick vegetation, and stone walls turned every field into a fortress. German tanks, superior in armour and firepower, ambushed Allied columns with devastating effect. But for every Sherman destroyed, replacements arrived from the beaches. American crews learned quickly. They welded steel teeth to the front of their Shermans, cutting through hedgerows instead of climbing over them. They coordinated with infantry, using combined arms tactics to flush out German positions. When a German tank was spotted, artillery plastered the area while tank destroyers moved into firing positions. If the first shot missed, there were always more tanks to take another. One German Panther commander, interviewed after the war, described the Normandy fighting as surreal. We would destroy 5, sometimes 10 Shermans in a single engagement. Then we would pull back to refuel and rearm. When we returned, there would be 20 more waiting. It was like fighting a factory. That was exactly what it was, a factory with tracks, guns, and the will to grind forward no matter the cost. By late summer 1944, the breakout from Normandy had begun. American armoured divisions, spearheaded by Shermans, raced across France faster than the German army could retreat. Entire panzer divisions were encircled, starved of fuel, and destroyed. The Falaise pocket alone consumed thousands of German vehicles, many abandoned because there was no diesel to move them. Meanwhile, Allied supply lines stretched across France, fed by trucks, trains, and an unending stream of ships crossing the Atlantic. The numbers were staggering. By the end of 1944, America had delivered over 40,000 Shermans to the European and Pacific theatres. Germany had produced fewer than 25,000 tanks of all types in the entire war. The disparity wasn't just numerical, it was philosophical. America had built a war machine designed to replace losses faster than they could be inflicted. Germany had built an army that could not afford to lose, and the losses were mounting. Every Panther destroyed was a blow to Germany's dwindling reserves. Every Tiger lost represented weeks of irreplaceable production. Crews who survived one battle often had no tank to climb into for the next. Replacement vehicles arrived in trickles, if at all. Training programs collapsed as fuel shortages, grounded instructors, and destroyed vehicles couldn't be replaced for practice. By contrast, American tankers who lost their Shermans were often back in action within days. Fresh crews rotated in from training camps in the States, where thousands of men learned to operate the same standardized machine. When they arrived in Europe, they stepped into tanks identical to the ones they had trained on. No adaptation required. No learning curve, just muscle memory and a manual that fit in a cargo pocket. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. The winter of 1944 brought Germany's last great gamble. The Ardennes offensive, known to history as the Battle of the Bulge, it was a desperate thrust through the forests of Belgium, aimed at splitting the Allied lines and recapturing the port of Antwerp. For a few days, it seemed to work. German armour, including the newest King Tigers and Panthers, smashed through thinly held American positions. Fog grounded Allied aircraft. Fuel depots were overrun. Panic rippled through Allied command. But even in retreat, the American system held. Shermans from reserve units poured into the gap. Tank destroyers raced to block roads. Artillery battalions, many equipped with proximity-fused shells that detonated above ground in devastating airbursts, turned narrow lanes into kill zones. And when the weather cleared, the sky filled with Allied bombers and fighter bombers that turned every German column into burning wreckage. The German offensive, launched with such hope, collapsed within weeks. Not because American tanks were better, they weren't, but because American logistics were unbreakable. Every German advance stretched their supply lines thinner. Every mile gained burned fuel they couldn't replace. When the attack stalled, entire panzer divisions sat immobilized, their tanks out of gasoline, their crews walking back toward Germany through snow and shellfire. The Shermans, meanwhile, kept rolling. Supplied by the Red Ball Express, a trucking operation that delivered thousands of tons of fuel, ammunition, and food daily, American units recovered faster than Germany could regroup. Damaged Shermans were towed to field workshops and returned to service. Destroyed ones were replaced from depots that seemed bottomless. The battle that was supposed to turn the war instead became Germany's funeral. By early 1945, the end was visible from both sides. Germany's tank production had collapsed entirely. Factories were rubble. The few vehicles still being built lacked engines, optics, or radios. Crews trained on wooden mock-ups because no real tanks were available. Fuel reserves had evaporated. Some Panther units received orders to advance, only to discover their tanks couldn't move. America, by contrast, had built so many Shermans that production was actually scaled back. There were more tanks than crews, more ammunition than storage, more spare parts than the depots could hold. The assembly lines that had once run 24 hours slowed to single shifts, not because the war was over, but because the war was won. The industrial gap had become a chasm, and Germany had fallen into it. Otto Carius, the tank commander from the opening scene, survived the war. In his memoirs, he wrote with brutal honesty about what he had witnessed. "We were told we had the best tanks, the best training, the best tactics, and perhaps we did, but the Americans had something we could never match. They had enough tanks to replace every loss, enough fuel to keep moving, enough will to keep building. We fought with excellence. They fought with everything." The specific encounters tell the story more clearly than any strategic analysis ever could. Near Cologne, March 1945, a single German Panther sat hull down behind rubble, its commander scanning for targets. When a column of 5 Shermans rounded a corner, he fired immediately. The first Sherman exploded, its turret lifting off in a gout of flame. The second took a hit that punched through the glacis plate and ignited the ammunition. Both crews died before they could bail out. But the remaining 3 Shermans didn't retreat. They scattered, using buildings for cover, radioing coordinates to supporting units. Within minutes, artillery shells began walking toward the Panther's position. A tank destroyer maneuvered down a parallel street. 2 more Shermans arrived from a different avenue. The Panther commander fired again, destroying a 3rd Sherman. But now he was surrounded. Shells hammered his position from 3 directions. When one finally penetrated his thinner side armor, the Panther burned just as surely as the Shermans had. The American battalion commander filed a report noting the loss of 3 tanks and 7 men. By the next morning, 3 replacement Shermans had arrived from the rear echelon. The Panther, irreplaceable, was left smoking in the street. Its crew, highly trained veterans, were gone forever. This pattern repeated across Germany in the final months. German tanks won individual battles but lost the war of arithmetic. The mathematics of tank warfare had become brutally simple. A Sherman cost $50,000 to produce and took 6 weeks from raw steel to finished vehicle. A Panther cost $120,000 and required 4 months to build. The Sherman had a crew of 5 men who received 3 months of training. The Panther crew received 6 months of intensive instruction because the vehicle was more complex to operate and maintain. In a one-on-one duel, the Panther almost always won, but the war wasn't fought in duels. At Aryan in September 1944, the 4th Armoured Division engaged elements of the 5th Panzer Army in what should have been a decisive German victory. The Germans had newer Panthers and Panzer IVs with upgraded guns. They had veteran crews and favourable terrain. They had been told, once again, that American tanks were inferior and American tankers were poorly trained. The battle shattered these assumptions permanently. The American forces used coordinated tactics that German commanders couldn't counter. When Panthers appeared, Shermans didn't charge them directly. They manoeuvred to flanks, forced the Germans to expose their thinner side armour, called in artillery to suppress supporting infantry, and used air support to strike German assembly areas before reinforcements could arrive. In 5 days of fighting, the Germans lost 86 tanks, the Americans lost 25 Shermans, but by the end of the week, 22 replacement vehicles had arrived from depots. German tank commander Ernst Bachmann, who survived the battle, later wrote about the psychological impact. "We were told we had the superior tanks, and we did. We were told we had the superior training, and we did. But what use is superiority when you are outnumbered 5-1? when every tank you destroy is replaced before you can refuel, when American artillery can drop shells on your position within minutes. Of being spotted? We fought with skill. They fought with systems. Systems won. In the East Prussian town of Königsberg, a company of Tiger IIs, the most powerful tanks Germany ever produced, ambushed a Soviet-American joint convoy. Their 128mm guns destroyed 11 tanks before concentrated return fire, disabled 2 Tigers, and forced the rest to withdraw. The Germans celebrated a tactical victory, but within days, the Soviets and Americans had replaced every lost vehicle. The Tigers never returned to action. Their fuel was gone. Interviews with German tankers after the war reveal a common psychological breaking point. It wasn't fear of death. It was the realization that excellence didn't matter. One Panzer IV commander described his final battle near the Elbe River. "We destroyed 8 American tanks in 20 minutes. Perfect gunnery, perfect positioning. We felt invincible. Then we saw more coming over the hill. And more behind them. And more. We retreated, not because we were beaten, but because we understood we could never kill enough of them to matter." That understanding came too late for many. By April 1945, German tank units existed more on paper than in reality. Orders were issued to divisions that had no vehicles. Attack plans called for armoured spearheads that consisted of 3 or 4 operational tanks. Crews sat in foxholes, weapons in hand, waiting for machines that would never arrive. Meanwhile, American and Soviet forces converged on Berlin with thousands of tanks rolling forward in unstoppable columns. The final statistics are almost incomprehensible. Between 1942 and 1945, the United States produced 49,234 Sherman tanks. Germany produced approximately 25,000 tanks of all types during the entire war, including obsolete models. When Italian, Japanese, and other Axis production is added, the total reaches roughly 47,000. America alone outproduced the entire Axis alliance, but the disparity extended beyond raw numbers. Of those 49,000 Shermans, the vast majority reached frontline units in working condition. They arrived with full fuel tanks, complete ammunition loads, and crews trained on identical machines. When they were damaged, spare parts were abundant. When they were destroyed, replacements were immediate. The entire system, from factory floor to front line, functioned as a single integrated organism. Germany's 25,000 tanks, by contrast, suffered from fragmentation and desperation. Different models required different parts, different ammunition, different training. The Panzer III used different engines than the Panzer IV. The Tiger used different tracks than the Panther. Field workshops couldn't keep up. Tanks sat disabled, waiting for components that were being produced for different models. Others were cannibalized to keep a few operational. By war's end, German depots were filled with incomplete tanks, chassis without turrets, turrets without guns, engines without transmissions. The industrial ecosystem had collapsed, leaving behind the skeletal remains of ambition. The Sherman's story in the Pacific Theatre offers a parallel lesson in adaptability. When the M4 arrived in the jungles of the Solomon Islands, New Guinea, and the Philippines, it faced challenges utterly different from Europe. Japanese tanks were lighter, smaller, and designed for infantry support rather than tank versus tank combat. The Type 97 Chiha, Japan's most common tank, weighed 15 tons and carried a 57mm gun. Against a 30-ton Sherman with a 75mm gun and 2 inches of sloped armor, it was outmatched in every category. Japanese tank tactics, built around surprise and speed, crumbled when they encountered American armor that could shrug off their shells while destroying them at range. At the Battle of Tarawa in November 1943, Japanese Type 95 Hago light tanks charged American positions in a desperate night attack. Marines equipped with bazookas and anti-tank guns destroyed them within minutes. When Shermans arrived the next day, they methodically hunted down the remaining Japanese armor, firing high explosive shells into bunkers and fortifications. The engagement was so one-sided it barely qualified as combat, but the Pacific presented challenges no European battlefield could match: jungles thick enough to hide entire battalions, rivers with no bridges, mountains with no roads, heat that turned tank interiors into ovens where temperatures exceeded 130 degrees Fahrenheit, humidity that rusted ammunition and fouled engines within days, and islands where every yard gained cost, lives measured by the dozen. The Sherman adapted because it had been designed to adapt. At Peleliu in September 1944, Marine Corps Shermans faced their most difficult Pacific battle. The island's coral ridges and cave systems negated the tank's mobility advantages. Japanese anti-tank guns, hidden in fortified positions, could strike from multiple directions. The Marines lost several Shermans in the first hours to 47mm guns firing from concealed positions. But American tankers learned quickly. They began operating in pairs, one Sherman providing covering fire while the other maneuvered. They coordinated with infantry who marked Japanese positions with colored smoke. They used white phosphorus shells to burn out cave entrances before approaching. When conventional ammunition proved insufficient against reinforced bunkers, they requested flamethrower variants. The M4A3R3, mounting a flamethrower in place of the hull machine gun, could project burning napalm over 100 yards. The psychological impact of these flame tanks on Japanese defenders was devastating. Soldiers who had been trained to fight to the death, who had willingly charged into machine gun fire, broke and ran when flame tanks approached. The weapon violated something fundamental in human psychology. Bullets could be endured, fire could not. At Iwo Jima and Okinawa, flame Shermans became the single most requested support weapon, more valuable than artillery, more feared than aircraft. Japanese soldiers, taught that American equipment was inferior and American soldiers were cowardly, struggled to reconcile propaganda with reality. Captured diaries reveal a recurring theme of shock and disbelief. One entry from Saipan, dated June 1944, reads, "We were told their tanks were weak and poorly made, but they do not break. They do not stop. Even when we hit them, they keep coming. How can we fight an enemy who replaces everything we destroy?" Another diary, found on Okinawa, contained a more desperate assessment. "The Americans fight like machines. When we destroy one tank, another appears. When we kill one crew, another takes their place. They have no spirit, no honor, yet they win because they have everything. Food, fuel, ammunition, tanks. We have courage and nothing else. Courage is not enough." The answer, of course, was that they couldn't. Japan's industrial base, even at its peak, was a fraction of America's. The entire Japanese empire produced fewer than 6,000 tanks during the war. Most were light models designed for colonial policing, not modern armored warfare. When American Shermans landed on Pacific Islands, Japanese commanders had no counter, no heavy tanks to oppose them, no anti-tank guns capable of reliable kills at range, no infrastructure to replace losses. Japanese tank production tells its own story of industrial inadequacy. The Mitsubishi factory in Tokyo, Japan's primary tank manufacturer, could produce approximately 15 tanks per month at peak capacity. That same month, the single Fisher body plant in Grand Blanc, Michigan, produced over 300 Shermans. One American factory outproduced Japan's entire tank industry by a factor of 20, and America had 11 such factories running simultaneously. The strategic implications were catastrophic for Japan. Every island invasion saw American forces landing with tank support, while Japanese defenders had, at best, a handful of light tanks that were quickly destroyed. By 1944, Japanese commanders stopped even trying to counter American armor with their own tanks. Instead, they buried tanks in the ground as static pillboxes, using them as immobile gun positions because they had no fuel to move them and no hope of surviving against Shermans in mobile combat. Engineers welded improvised armor to protect against magnetic mines. Crews mounted additional machine guns to suppress infantry in dense vegetation. Flamethrower variants, the M4A3R3, were developed specifically for burning Japanese soldiers out of bunkers and caves. At Iwo Jima and Okinawa, these tanks became the most feared weapons in the American arsenal, spraying napalm into fortified positions that conventional explosives couldn't reach. Japanese soldiers, taught that American equipment was inferior and American soldiers were cowardly, struggled to reconcile propaganda with reality. Captured diaries reveal a recurring theme of shock and disbelief. One entry from Saipan, dated June 1944, reads, "We were told their tanks were weak and poorly made, but they do not break, they do not stop. Even when we hit them, they keep coming. How can we fight an enemy who replaces everything we destroy?" The answer, of course, was that they couldn't. Japan's industrial base, even at its peak, was a fraction of America's. The entire Japanese Empire produced fewer than 6,000 tanks during the war. Most were light models designed for colonial policing, not modern armored warfare. When American Shermans landed on Pacific Islands, Japanese commanders had no counter, no heavy tanks to oppose them, no anti-tank guns capable of reliable kills, no infrastructure to replace losses. By 1945, Japanese tank units had effectively ceased to exist. The few remaining vehicles were buried as static pillboxes, immobile and invisible, waiting to fire a single shot before being obliterated by naval gunfire or airstrikes. It was a fitting end for an armoured force that had never understood the central truth of mechanized war. Tanks are not individual weapons. They are components of a system, and the system that produces the most wins. The human cost of this industrial imbalance is harder to quantify, but impossible to ignore. American tank crews faced a brutal calculus. Shermans could be penetrated by German guns at ranges where they couldn't effectively return fire. Crews knew that facing a Tiger or Panther meant accepting casualties, yet they also knew that if they died, another crew would take their place in a fresh tank. The war would continue, and without them. German crews faced a different horror. They often had superior machines and superior training, but no replacements. Every battle might be their last, not because they would die, but because their tank would be lost, and no new one would arrive. Survival meant fighting until the vehicle was destroyed, then retreating on foot. Interviews with veterans reveal men who excelled tactically but were ground down psychologically by the inevitability of defeat. One Panther driver, captured near Aachen in October 1944, told his interrogators, "We knew we were better tankers. We proved it every day. But they had 10 tanks for every one of ours, then 20, then 30. You cannot win that war. You can only delay losing it." That delay cost lives on both sides, but it was Germany that bled resources it could never recover. The final acts of the war saw German tank commanders making decisions that would have been unthinkable years earlier, abandoning operational vehicles because there was no fuel to drive them, scuttling Tigers and Panthers to prevent capture, not by destroying them in battle, but by setting demolition charges because retreating infantry couldn't take them along, ordering tank crews to fight as infantry because there were no tanks left to crew. In the Ruhr Pocket, April 1945, an entire panzer corps surrendered with fewer than a dozen operational tanks among 3 divisions. Their officers, when questioned, expressed not shame but exhaustion. They had fought brilliantly with nothing, and nothing had been enough. American forces accepting the surrender counted row after row of Shermans parked in reserve, engines idling, ready for battles that would never come because the enemy had simply run out of the ability to resist. The Sherman itself was never the best tank of World War II. That title arguably belongs to the German Panther, or perhaps the Soviet 34, depending on criteria. But best is a meaningless metric in total war. The Sherman was the right tank, right for the factories that built it, right for the ships that carried it, right for the crews that fought in it, right for the war that needed it. Its legacy extends far beyond the war itself. The principles that guided its design, standardization, mass production, ease of maintenance, and logistical integration, became the foundation of modern military procurement. Every tank built since owes a debt to the lessons learned on the Sherman assembly lines, not in armor thickness or gun caliber, but in the understanding that wars are won by systems, not by individual machines. The Sherman served in over 50 countries after 1945. Israel used modified Shermans in the 1967 Six-Day War. Their upgraded 75mm guns replaced with French 105mm cannons. Argentina and Chile operated Shermans into the 1980s. Paraguay used them in the Chaco War as late as the 1990s. The design's simplicity meant it could be maintained and modified long after more sophisticated tanks had rusted into scrap. Veterans of Sherman crews speak of the tank with a complicated affection. They knew its weaknesses intimately, the way its armor could be penetrated by German guns, the tendency of early models to catch fire when hit, earning the nickname Ronson after the lighter that advertised lights every time, the height that made it visible from miles away. But they also remember that it brought them home, that when it was hit, the crew often survived because the hull didn't fragment like German armor sometimes did, that it was reliable in ways that kept them alive through mechanical failures that would have stranded them in enemy territory. One veteran, interviewed in the 1990s, put it simply, "The Sherman wasn't the toughest tank or the strongest tank, but it was our tank, and there were always more of them. That mattered more than any gun or any armor. We could lose and keep fighting. They couldn't." The factories that built the Shermans didn't stop at war's end. They retooled for peacetime production, building automobiles, tractors, and industrial equipment. The workers who had welded tank hulls went back to civilian life. The assembly lines that had run 24 hours fell silent, but the knowledge remained. America had learned to mobilize its industrial base for total war, to convert an entire economy into a weapon, to outproduce any enemy by such margins that victory became mathematical rather than heroic. That knowledge, dormant but not forgotten, would shape the Cold War, the space race, and every conflict that followed. The Sherman tank was a tool, but the system that created it was a revelation. Germany lost World War II for many reasons. Strategic blunders, resource shortages, fighting on multiple fronts, and ideological madness all played their part. But among those reasons, buried beneath the grand narratives of battles and campaigns, is a simpler truth. They lost because they built 25,000 tanks in 6 years, and their enemy built 50,000 in 4. They lost because excellence is not scalable, but production is. They lost because they believed in quality when the world had moved on to quantity. Otto Carius survived the war and opened a pharmacy in Germany. He lived quietly until 2015, rarely speaking about his experiences. But in his memoirs, published decades after the war, he returned again and again to that moment in December 1944, standing beside his disabled Tiger, watching the horizon fill with Shermans. Not an army, a factory, not soldiers, a system. He wrote, "I had been taught that German tanks were invincible, that our training, our tactics, our courage would prevail, and perhaps, in another war, they would have. But this was not that war. This was a war of production, and we had lost it before we even knew we were fighting it. The Americans didn't defeat us with better tanks, they defeated us with more, and, in the end, more was all that mattered." The sky above the battlefield that day had been grey and cold. Snow beginning to fall. The Shermans kept coming, their silhouettes identical, their movements coordinated, their purpose singular. Each one carrying a crew that knew if they died, another would take their place. Each one built in a factory that had 10 more waiting. Each one proof that the age of the craftsman warrior had ended, and the age of industrial war had begun. Germany had built masterpieces. America had built a system. History does not remember who built the best. It remembers who built enough. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.